Hello, in this video we are going to take the example problem we did in the last video and actually do it properly. We might not have learned loops yet, but I think it's a good point just to kind of highlight how to do this because we want to start training our brains to see these types of things to know when to implement loop structures. So really simply put, I'll write a really simple note up here. Loop structures are structures that can repeat a section of code. That's it. There are two broad classifications of loops. There are conditional loops, which are while loops, and we tend to use these when we don't know in advance how many times the loop should run. So a classic example is when you're taking an input and you're error checking that input, you don't know how many times the user is going to put the wrong thing in. A while loop is really useful there. It's a conditional loop. The other classification, broad classification of loops are called counting loops. And the example we're going to look at is called a for loop. And in Python, there's a bunch of different formats of the for loop designed to kind of make life easier. But they all fall into this idea of what's called a for loop. And we tend to use these when we do know in advance how many times the loop should run. Now this is a kind of generalized rule. What's important to know that ultimately you can use any loop in any situation. They're completely interchangeable. It just happens to be that certain loops are more convenient in certain situations. So if I take a look at my example down here, just to remind you, essentially what I'm doing is counting the number of values that the user inputs that are less than 10. And what I notice is that I'm actually doing the same chunk of code over and over again. So here, this is just repeated 6 times because I want to take 6 inputs. So this is a perfect candidate to use a loop on it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all the examples of doing that except for the last one. I'm going to delete it. And so now what I need to do is I have to loop. This is the section of code that needs to be looped, right? Because I need to take an input, convert it to an integer, check the value, and then increment the counter if appropriate. And that's what I'm going to loop. Because this example question says that you want to do this 6 times, I know in advance how many times I want to do this. So the best candidate here is called a for loop. And the way we set them up is as follows. For, and then we pick a variable that's going to simulate our counter. Imagine someone asked you to do something a number of times and you count on your finger each time you do it. That's what this variable here represents. This variable here represents my counter. It's going to keep track for I in range. And this is where I set up my counting system. And the way I like to think about this is I think about it as count, check, change. And what I mean by that is count is the initialization of the counter. So it's what is my counter going to start at? And I can start it at anything. Check is the check that is applied to the counter to see if I want to continue to loop, because if that check is true, I loop again. And the change is what happens after each iteration of the loop. Count, check, change. This is a phrase that I've come up with some students, and it seems to be kind of useful. So if I come down here, I'm going to set I initially to 0. My check is going to be that I is less than 6, and my change is 1. I'm going to increment I by 1 each time, and I have to put a colon at the end here. And this is me just getting my notation mixed up. There we go. So I now have this set up where I is going to be initialized to 0. We're going to keep going as long as I is less than 6, and we're going to increment I by 1 each time. So if I tap this in and I tap this in, so everything that I want inside this loop, I'm going to tap in. And now if I run this, what we'll see So input value, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you've entered a number less than 10 6 times. Now maybe this will be helpful. Input value, and I'm going to actually put here, comma I, comma. Actually, I'm going to say plus str. Okay, so what have I done here? So I've set up my loop for my count check change, we call it. So my count is I is going to start off at 0. We're going to keep looping as long as I is less than 6, and each time we're going to increment I by 1. So what happens here is it comes down here and it sets I to 0, and it says, is 0 less than 6? True. It enters the loop. It runs all the way to the bottom, and then when we get to the bottom of the code, it does two things. First, it changes counter variable, which in our case is I. And then if true, if condition true, or let's say if check is true, loop again. Count check change. And I've actually displayed I here, so when we run this now, what you're going to notice, and let's zoom this in a bit, input value 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, so each time this is printing out I for me. Now, what I might want to do here is, I want to say input value 1, input value 2, input value 3, but the problem is it says input value 0. So I can change my count check change. My count's going to start at 1, my check is going to go to 7 now, and I'm going to increment by 1. So if I run this, input value 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And this is what's called a for loop. You can do a lot of things with these. What you're looking for at this stage is that if you have components of code that is repetitive, that tends to be an indication that a loop is a useful structure to simplify your process. I hope this helped, and as always, ask any questions you want.